Grant Whitfield was picking up a routine prescription refill when he noticed her, a young woman standing at the customer service counter, sliding an unopened can of baby formula back across to the cashier with the practiced steadiness of someone who'd rehearsed the motion in her head before actually having to perform it. She wasn't returning it for a different brand. Grant could tell that much from the careful way she counted the refund into her palm afterward, coin by coin, as if the exact total mattered more than anything else happening in the store. Time seemed to stand still for Grant in that pharmacy aisle. He'd walked past 1,000 transactions like this one without a second glance in his life. Something about this particular exchange refused to let him look away. To understand why Grant stopped walking that afternoon, you have to understand what the years leading up to it had quietly hollowed out of him. At 47, Grant was founder and CEO of Whitfield Consumer Goods, a company he'd built from a single regional distribution deal into a $920 million enterprise, supplying household products to retailers across 11 states. His divorce had finalized 5 years earlier, amicably enough on paper, though the silence that followed had never really lifted. His daughter Claire hadn't spoken to him directly in over a year, the fallout from a father who'd mistaken providing for presents for most of her childhood. He owned a 7-bedroom house he rattled around in alone. He'd spent the last 5 Thanksgivings eating catered meals by himself at a kitchen island built for a family that no longer gathered there. Success, it turned out, had been remarkably easy to build, and remarkably useless at keeping loneliness out of the house. Grant lingered near the counter longer than necessary, close enough to catch the tail end of the transaction. "That brings your total down to $41.20, the cashier said. The young woman glanced at the register display, then at the exact bills in her hand, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "That works," she said quietly. "Thank you." Grant did the math himself, watching her rearrange the remaining items in her cart: diapers, a small package of wipes, nothing else. The formula hadn't been a preference swap. She'd been exactly $14.50 short at checkout, and out of everything in her cart, the formula was the one thing she'd judged safe enough to sacrifice, without her baby going, without something more essential. It was only then that Grant noticed the infant strapped snugly against the woman's chest in a worn carrier, no older than 3 months, sleeping soundly, mercifully unaware of the calculation her mother had just been forced to make on her behalf. The woman's face carried the particular exhaustion of someone running on far too little sleep for far too long, and underneath that exhaustion, something harder to watch directly: humiliation, carefully contained, the kind that comes from being watched count change in a public checkout line and having no way to disappear from the moment. He saw not just her worn expression, but the sheer effort it took her to hold her composure in front of strangers who'd already stopped pretending not to notice. Grant didn't make a scene. He'd learned over decades of negotiating deals worth far more than a can of formula that the quietest interventions were usually the ones that actually helped. He waited until the woman had stepped away from the register, then approached the cashier directly. "The formula she just returned. Can you ring it back up and add it to my order instead?" He paid, took the small bag, and caught up to her in the parking lot before she reached her car. "Excuse me," he said, holding it out. "I think you forgot this." She stared at the bag, then at him, confusion giving way to understanding, giving way to something close to panic. "I can't accept that. I don't even know you." "Every parent needs a break sometimes," Grant said simply. "This one's on me. No strings attached." She caught up to his car before he'd even gotten the door open, too proud to simply let a stranger's charity go unaddressed. "Please let me pay you back," she said. "I don't take handouts. I've never taken handouts." "It's $14, Grant said gently. "I promise you it won't bankrupt me." "That's not the point," she said, and something in her composure finally gave way entirely. "The point is, I'm 3 weeks behind on rent. I work overnight. Warehouse shifts so I can be with her during the day, and I still can't make the math work every single week, and I have no one." Her voice cracked. "I have literally no family I can call when it gets like this." Her trembling voice carried years of silent heartbreak that clearly had very little to do with $14 of formula. Her name was Jasmine Reeves, 24 years old, and the isolation she'd just admitted to wasn't circumstantial. It was the defining architecture of her entire adult life. Jasmine had aged out of the foster care system at 18 with no family reunification, no inheritance, and no safety net beyond a single duffel bag and a caseworker's business card she'd since lost. She'd put herself through 2 years of community college, working toward a degree in medical billing, before an unplanned pregnancy, and the baby's father's sudden disappearance 6 months into the pregnancy had derailed nearly everything she'd built. "I don't have parents to call when I need help," she told Grant. "I don't have a childhood home to move back into. It's just me and her, and some weeks the math just doesn't work, no matter how many shifts I pick up." Grant stood in that parking lot turning something over in his mind. Not pity, but recognition, sharp and unexpected. "I run a company called Whitfield Consumer Goods," he said. "We have an administrative traineeship program that's been sitting mostly dormant for years. Paid, flexible scheduling. Built for exactly this kind of second chance. I'd like to offer you a position, not as charity, as an actual job, with actual pay, structured around your daughter's needs." Jasmine's eyes narrowed, wary in the particular way of someone who had learned that generosity from strangers usually came with conditions attached. "Why would you do that? You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," Grant said. "Take a few days to think about it. Here's my card. No pressure either way." It wasn't until Jasmine's second week at Whitfield Consumer Goods, during a quiet lunch where Grant had stopped by unannounced, that he finally explained why the sight of her at that counter had hit him as hard as it had. "My mother aged out of a group home herself," he said. "She raised me completely alone, working 2 jobs most of my childhood. When I was 9, she returned a bag of groceries at a checkout counter. Not formula, but close enough, so she'd have enough left over to buy me new shoes for school. I watched her count change exactly the way you did. I've never told anyone that story. Not my ex-wife, not my own daughter." Jasmine sat with that for a long moment. "Why tell me?" "Because I think you needed to know this wasn't pity," Grant said. "It was recognition. There's a difference." Jasmine had shown up on her actual first day, nervous and overdressed, half convinced the entire offer had been some temporary act of pity that would quietly dissolve the moment real scrutiny arrived. Instead, she found a structured onboarding process, an actual employee handbook, a training schedule, a supervisor named Denise who walked her through payroll systems and scheduling software with the same patience she'd have given any other new hire. No awareness at all of the parking lot conversation that had brought Jasmine there in the first place. "You're doing fine," Denise told her, halfway through the first week. "Better than fine, actually. You pick things up fast." It was, Jasmine would later say, the first time in years someone had evaluated her purely on her own merit, with no charity attached to the assessment at all. Word of how Jasmine had been hired eventually made its way quietly through the office, not through Grant, who never mentioned it, but through a warehouse manager who'd overheard part of the original conversation with Denise. Rather than resentment, it sparked something Grant hadn't anticipated. 6 separate employees, over the following month, approached HR asking how the Second Chance traineeship program could be expanded, whether it could formally absorb more candidates like Jasmine, instead of sitting dormant the way it had for the better part of 4 years. A single quiet act in a pharmacy parking lot had, without any deliberate campaign behind it, begun reshaping a small corner of company culture from the ground up. The story eventually reached Claire, Grant's estranged daughter, through a mutual acquaintance who mentioned it in passing with no idea of the weight it would carry once it landed. Claire called her father for the first time in over a year. "Someone told me what you did for that woman at the pharmacy," she said, voice careful, testing the water of a relationship neither of them had tended in a long time. "That sounds like the version of you I remember from before everything got complicated. I didn't think that version was still in there." "I didn't either, if I'm honest," Grant admitted. "I'd like to see you. No agenda, just dinner." It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was the first real door either of them had opened in longer than either wanted to count. A year after the parking lot, Jasmine had transitioned from trainee to permanent staff, earning $52,000 annually with full health benefits, a figure that would have seemed impossible to her 12 months earlier, counting $14 in a pharmacy checkout line. She'd moved into a stable two-bedroom apartment, no longer 3 weeks behind on anything, and had begun setting aside a portion of every paycheck into a savings account earmarked for her daughter's future, a kind of security she genuinely believed, for most of her adult life, was permanently out of reach for someone with her particular history. Whitfield Consumer Goods formally relaunched its Second Chance hiring initiative that same year, expanding it into a structured program with dedicated funding of $340,000 annually and clear pathways from traineeship to permanent employment. Grant insisted the program not carry his own name. Instead, at Jasmine's quiet suggestion, it was named the Second Can Program, a small, deliberately understated nod to the exact moment that had started it all, understood fully only by the two people who'd stood in that parking lot together. It began with a single, unremarkable transaction, a young mother returning a can of formula she couldn't afford, counting change in front of strangers who mostly looked away. Grant Whitfield didn't look away, and in choosing to notice one woman's dignity instead of her desperation, he unraveled a loneliness that had been quietly hollowing out both of their lives from opposite directions. Hers built from scarcity, his built from excess, both of them starving, in their own ways, for someone to actually see them. Sometimes the smallest acts of attention carry the longest reach, rippling forward into jobs, into reconciliations, into futures. Neither party could have predicted standing at a checkout counter on an ordinary afternoon.